good evening. It's great to see so many of you here. You know, it really is a testament to David to draw this crowd on a day when the president is speaking. You know, so that's pretty good. But it's always great to see so many familiar faces, and those of you who are attending this for the first time, welcome to Concordia's campus. I'm V.G. George, the president of Concordia College. This is our first in the series, and it really is always a pleasure to do this and welcome friends and members of the campus community. Without further ado, let me pass this on to Ellen, who will introduce our speaker for this evening. Again, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Am I on? Anyway, I'd like to add my welcome to VG's, greeting all of you for our 32nd year of the Books and Coffee program. And as always, I'd like to thank the friends in the audience for their generous support, because it's really your support that makes these programs possible. So if you're not a friend already, I love new friends, and there's information outside, so please join us. And I hope you all had a chance to fill out a raffle card. The lucky winner will get a book chosen by our author, the winner will be chosen by the author and signed. And if you don't win, we're still winners, because Jean from Womrath is outside selling books after the program. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce our featured guest. It's a great honor and pleasure to introduce David Westin, a loyal, longtime Concordia friend and Bronxville neighbor. And I'm eager, like all of you, to hear him discuss his book, Exit Interview, reflecting on his 13 years as president of ABC News, published in May of this year by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. That's the hardest pronunciation of any publisher. About his book, Walter Isaacson said, "It's both a fascinating inside look at television news and a thoughtful analysis of the ethical dilemmas of journalism." David Westin writes with delightful charm and draws lessons that are enlightening not only for journalists, but for everyone. Max Robbins of the Wall Street Journal Online called Westin adroit, a statesman journalist, a leader who faced adversity with equanimity. Jessica Gresko of the AP declared Westin extremely thoughtful and profoundly committed to telling interesting and difficult stories. But I think George Stephanopoulos said it best when he said Exit Interview is a masterclass in journalism. David's book has no gossip nor axe to grind. The fact that I was looking for that kind of speaks to his point about audience expectations and responsibility, so shame on me. But Exit Interview presents a measured, fair, and scholarly approach to journalism and the business of journalism. Clearly, David's legal background proved very helpful in his work at ABC News, knowing what questions to ask, what to look for, and what to avoid. But in reading David's book, I could not help but feel that his book is a tribute to the value of a liberal arts education. David's undergraduate years and law school at the University of Michigan gave him a wonderful breadth of knowledge and enabled his nimbleness in adapting and excelling in each of his careers. From clerking for Chief Justice Powell, to becoming a partner at Wilmer Cutler & Pickering, to general counsel at Capital Cities ABC, to head of ABC Network, and then ABC News. I mean, really. His remarkable success is an inspiration for our students here in Concordia, and really for the whole next generation of students who will be facing many jobs in their lifetime. His career is an example of do what you love, but be willing to work hard to gain a breadth of knowledge to make you nimble enough to fashion a living out of what you love. In Exit Interview, David advocates for an open, curious mind, and that's exactly what a liberal arts education does. It's all about shaping minds to adapt, grow, flourish, and contribute. And when you're David Westin, the contributions are many and very remarkable. Please welcome me in welcoming David Westin.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, and thank you all for being here. In case you're worried, we're not going to go until 10 o'clock, so you will get to see the president At least as far as I'm concerned. I'm a little more worried about the beginning sets of Djokovic versus Del Potro. So, but I'm sure it'll go 3 or 4 sets, so you'll get to see the end of it before you're done here. But thank you all very much for coming. As the president said, it does feel like coming home here because I've been here several times and have been involved with the people at Concordia over the years. And frankly, I was here for a breakfast. It must have been, I remember, 3 or 4 years ago. Does anyone remember? 2009, there you go. So, and I didn't know it at the time, but it was sort of the beginning of sort of a thought process that led to the book, because I talked about some of the things that were going on at ABC News when I was thinking about it, and I did a lot of thinking about that and some other things that ultimately gave rise to the book, even though I didn't know I was going to be writing the book at the time. And so, Mr. President, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Ellen, thank you very much for bringing this about. Ellen and the St. Fowls are sort of legends in my house, because they are very dear friends of a very dear friend of mine, a former law partner from Washington. And so I have heard about the St. Fowls for literally 30 years. 30 years. And
John, it's not true.
yeah, no, John's very honest, our mutual friend. But I can tell you, Ellen has been patient and persistent, and none of this would have happened without you, and I really appreciate it greatly, Ellen. As she said, I wrote this book it was about 13 years and 10 months, but who's counting, at ABC News, to tell some of the things I learned from covering various major news stories from inside. But before I go back in time a little bit, I'd like to go back just 30 or 60 days. Because I've spent a good part of the summer watching with some fascination the presidential campaigns, as I'm sure everybody here has. But particularly from one point of view, and I just like to start out with this because it is something I do have a chapter on in the book that speaks to this, and that I came to really feel very strongly about internally. And to take you back just a little bit about what I think we've seen going on in just one part of the presidential campaigns. If you remember back in the primaries, Governor Romney famously said, "I like to fire people." Remember that? And the Democrats jumped on him, and several Republicans jumped on him as well. But to their credit, a number of members of the media immediately took a look at it and said, well, wait a second. If you look at it in context, he wasn't talking about an employer firing employees. He was talking about people being able to change different healthcare systems. And the only firing going on was switching health insurance companies, which it's really hard to object to. Similarly, in July, President Obama, in talking about small businesses and some of the investment in infrastructure in this country, equally famously said, you didn't build that. And a number of Republicans jumped on that and said, well, that's telling small business owners they didn't build their small businesses. Again, a number of members of the media right quick got into it and said, no, wait a second, if you look at it, it was inartful, but what he was actually saying was you didn't build the infrastructure, the roads and the bridges and things like that. It was not artfully said, but in fact it was unfair. Both of these are examples of the media doing something that I think is terribly important and that frankly it has not done enough of recently. And that is going beyond what is represented and even the literal truth, because in fact Romney did say what he's quoted as saying, and Obama did say what he's quoted as saying, but the deeper truth was something different than that. And I saw this as a move away from what I believe is a false pursuit often of balance, no matter what the story. That there's a rigidity in the fair and balanced sort of mantra, when in fact some stories are not so fair and balanced. I'm going to give you 2 other more prominent examples, more recent, coming out of the campaign. Probably some of you, maybe many of you, read a cover piece in Newsweek by Neil Ferguson, the historian, the author, the professor, saying why he didn't think Obama should be reelected. And almost immediately, we had a number of people in the media go after Ferguson about exactly what he was saying, because he made a number of statements that, while factually accurate, were terribly misleading. For example, Paul Krugman immediately blogged on the New York Times saying, well, he is correct in saying projections about increased medical costs under the Obama plan, the costs will actually increase, but he leaves out the revenue part. And if you include the revenue part, the deficit doesn't go up, which was his central point. James Fallows pointed out that, well, the numbers he has on people losing their jobs are fine, except it goes back to January 2008 when our president was still named Bush. And so he's tagging with that, which I think is a very favorable move forward. There are stories that require balance because we don't know the answer to the question. I mean, these are things like What is appropriate in terms of abortion in this country? That is a normative question that reasonable minds can differ about, and we need balance on. There are also stories that in fact have right and wrong answers to them. And it is easier, and frankly it's less expensive, for journalists to just put up both sides of the story and let the audience try to decide. But for those kind of stories, I think there's an obligation that the journalists have to all of us in the audience to do the work, to dig out the facts, to really put them in the proper context, and to give us a sense not just of what factually happened, but what the truth of the matter was. We had this happen in the 2004 election. This is what I do talk about in the book. I mean, I'm sure all of you remember that John Kerry, when he ran for president in 2004, had various questions asked about him. But before that election began, the one thing we thought we all knew was that he was a war hero. I mean, he got a Silver Star, for goodness sakes. But in that summer of 2004, we had introduced to us the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. That became a huge issue within the media. There was extensive coverage everywhere, the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. But if you go back and look carefully at that coverage, and I was there at the time I watched it, the coverage, by and large, was, this is what they say, this is what he says, now let's talk about what the horse race is. And is that hurting him or is that helping him? What's it being done? The fact is, whether John Kerry was a war hero now is a fact. If you had been in Vietnam on that day in 1969 and watched what had happened, you would know he was either a war hero or he was a liar. This is not something on which reasonable minds can differ. Now, it may be hard to find that out, and I tell this story maybe because we come out well at ABC News, and we at Nightline sent a crew back to Vietnam. And we got out the old maps, and we got the GPS coordinates, and we went and found the village, and we found very elderly people who had been villagers at the time, and with a translator, we interviewed them. And by and large, they corroborated John Kerry's side of what had happened, exactly what he had said, and what had been reported in the military when they gave him the citation for the Silver Star. So this is an example where I think the media has gone into this false sense of balance, in the sense that if we just give you both sides of it, then we've done our job and walked away, which is terribly wrong. The fact is, facts are always true, but they can be misleading. And we have an obligation to you to try to lay that out whenever we can. So I think of what's been going on the last 30, 60 days, which is being talked about a lot on the internet, particularly, about the fact-checking going on. In fact, there was a lot of fact-checking of President Clinton's speech just last night. And by the way, the mainstream media at least came out and said, I think that basically the facts were right. But I think this is a very positive development that is terribly important, because I think that this idea of fair and balanced for all stories is potentially very destructive of what we're trying to accomplish. I wrote this book mainly, as I say, to give you a sense of what goes on behind the scenes, particularly in major news stories. The first job in journalism, think about this, it's a little frightening. The first job in journalism I ever had was president of ABC News. I'd never done any journalism before that in my life. And so you can imagine there was a fair amount of skepticism. At the time, it's funny thinking back on it, I couldn't understand why they were skeptical of me. I thought I was a reasonably smart, reasonably decent guy who was going to try really hard. And I'd worked with ABC News when I was general counsel, as Ellen referred to. I was general counsel, so I defended the news people a fair amount. I'd worked with them extensively. Then I'd run the network. I'd worked with them. They knew me. I knew them. But when I went in, there was a lot of skepticism. And it took me some time both to overcome some of the skepticism, but also to learn from some of the people I think are some of the greatest journalists of our generation. In difficult circumstances, covering difficult stories, to learn what really goes into journalism and the issues that are presented. It isn't to say that there isn't a lot to criticize in the journalism thing. There will always be a lot to criticize. I criticized a lot of what we were doing when I was there, for goodness sakes. But I do think it's important for people who haven't had the opportunity I've had to be inside that newsroom, seeing what's going on and seeing the decent men and women who are working really hard. We weren't trying to do it wrong. We were trying to get it right. And often we did get it right, sometimes we didn't. But there are a lot of people out there working on all of our behalf to try to really find out the truth about things that matter and tell us. And I wanted to give some sense of that. So now let me go back in history a little bit. The first big story that I really was responsible for supervising covering, was the death of Princess Diana, which was in 15 years ago, just about now, because it was Labor Day weekend, if you recall. The accident happened overnight on the Saturday night of Labor Day weekend in '97, and I'd been in the job about 4.5 months or so. And because it was Labor Day weekend, a lot of the leadership of ABC News was off somewhere, typically the Hamptons, but they were off somewhere. And that included Peter Jennings, our main anchor, and it included Roone Arledge, who was my predecessor and with whom I overlapped, and he was the chairman of ABC News at the time when I was president for about a year or so. But I was there, and so after they called me up, the way this works is you're at home on a weekend or in the middle of the night, in my experience. It's always some inconvenient time, and they call you from the desk, the news desk, and they say there's this incident, Princess Diana and her boyfriend, Dodi Fayed, have been in an accident, and we think that they've been injured. And then you start watching some of the coverage on TV, and you start following it some, and the story goes all over the place. I mean, in the early days of these stories, they never go in a straight line. You know, she's not injured at all, she's really badly injured, Dodi Fayed's okay, Dodi Fayed's really badly injured, Dodi Fayed's dead. And after this had happened for an hour or so, I said, you know, I just have a hunch she may be dead, and the palace just is not ready to announce it yet, so I'm going to go in. So I went into the newsroom. By this time it was early evening or so. And I quickly sort of talked to everybody and figured out who we had in position and who we could put on the air. And we were doing special reports to the whole network at this point, whenever we had an update about information. But we couldn't reach Peter Jennings for whatever reason. He was out in the Hamptons. And he was, it was a holiday, no reason why he should have been reachable. But we had our weekend anchor, Kevin Newman is his name, who was in over the weekend. And Roone we couldn't reach either. So one of the first things I did was to call in the woman who was overseeing all of our primetime programming and say, I think that she may be dead, and if so, we should do a primetime special tomorrow night. This would have been on the Sunday night of Labor Day weekend, because I think it's a big story. So she came in and started bringing other people in, and we started doing things you need to do to crash an hour in primetime. It may not sound like a lot. It is a lot of work to do in 24 hours. Because there's a lot of tape to pull together and people to interview and people to reach out to and bookings to do. So we started working on it. And then as the evening progressed, you know, of course we learned that in fact she had died, as had Dodi Fayed. And we went into a straight special report. So we were on the air for 4 or 5 hours straight, trying to learn as much as we could and feed it to the anchor and report it on the air. And we had a lot of help from the BBC. So I'm in the newsroom thinking we're doing pretty well, and I get a call about 11:15 at night, and it's Peter Jennings on the line. And Peter, with whom over time I developed, I'm happy to say, a very close relationship. We weren't so close at this point. He was very skeptical. He was the leader of the skeptics about me, because he was a journalist with a capital J, and he had doubts that he was great about because he just expressed them to me very directly. He was right up front with me. He said, most people think you're just passing through, that you don't really take this seriously. And they think you've just been sent in by the corporation. So this is a point where Peter was still testing me. So Peter gets on the phone, he said, David, you know, I understand that Princess Diana's died. And I said, yes, Peter, that's right. And he said, I also understand you're considering a primetime special. And I said, that's right, we've got Phyllis in and she's working on it. He said, well, David, that is your right. But I feel I owe it to you to tell you that if you do a primetime special on Princess Diana, no one will ever take you seriously as the president of ABC News. So here I'm 5 months into this thing. I know that I've got a newsroom that's skeptical of me, Peter being chief among them. And I've got Peter Jennings, who is a genuine legend, and justifiably so, a great journalist with a lot of experience, telling me I am really making a big mistake on my first big news call. So, and I didn't have a lot of journalism experience to draw back on to counter what he had to say. So what I did is I drew on my family, and I said, Peter, and it was just on the spot because I had to make a decision right away. I said, Peter, you know, I understand she wasn't the chief of state. She wasn't the head of state. She didn't command an army. But I have a sister back in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Her name is Rebecca, but I come from Michigan, and who never reads tabloids, ever. She has read every detail about this woman's life from the moment she got engaged to Prince Charles. And I think there are going to be other people who feel that way. And he said, and Peter typically didn't raise his voice, but he didn't have to. He let you know, when he felt strong about something. And he said, David, I said that is your right, but I will have nothing to do with it, and hung up. So this is my first big experience, in a breaking news situation. At which point I quickly called and got Barbara Walters and Diane Sawyer to agree to do it because I needed an anchor for the next night. Roone called in about 12:30 or so, and I told Roone about it. Roone was fed up. He was furious with Peter and said, it's ridiculous, whatever you do, don't let him be on the special, because Roone thought we should do the special. And then the next morning, Sunday, this is the way the story ends, The next morning, Peter's on the phone first thing to me, and he said, David, I'm in the car on the way in. I have read all the coverage. You were right, I was wrong, and I'd like to do the special. And I said, Peter, you're our main anchor. And if you're our principal anchor and you want to do the special, then of course you can do the special. But I owe it to you to tell you that Barbara Walters and Diane Sawyer are anchoring the special. So if you're going to do it, you have to do it with them. And Peter, to his great credit, without hesitating, said, fine, I'm happy to do that. And so what we did is we had a primetime special. It ended up being 2 hours. We had enough material. 2 hours with Peter Jennings, Barbara Walters, and Diane Sawyer all together, anchoring that night. And that's what happened. So that was my baptism in the news. Now, but to go back, in fairness to Peter, because Peter was right a lot more often than he was wrong. And he was right on some big news calls that I wish I'd listened more closely to on. I mean, he was skeptical about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq when I said, no matter what happens, I'm sure they'll be there if the U.S. goes in. I wish I'd listened more to him. And as an aside, I don't think he didn't have any inside information. He didn't have special intelligence information. And the overwhelming information we had from all the intelligence services was that people believed there were weapons of mass destruction. What he had was something perhaps as valuable, which is experience with that part of the world, and particularly with leaders and dictators in that part of the world. And he knew that nothing was ever as it seemed. And so he was skeptical. I wish we pursued it. But when it comes to Princess Diana, he was making a very important point. Even though he agreed he was wrong and came to that conclusion fairly quickly, he was making a very important point, which is something we struggled with throughout my almost 14 years there, which is the line between news and entertainment. He was making a bigger point. He was asking really, are you covering this because this is really of historical significance? Or are you covering this because you think a lot of people just want to watch it? And where do you draw that line? How do you make that decision? And that's something that we dealt with every day throughout my time there, and people are dealing with to this day. And it's not an easy thing to answer. There's no, in my experience, bright line there, and the line has moved. By the way, if this came up today, there's nobody who would question doing a primetime special on Princess Diana. It's very different. 15 years later, that line has moved, without a doubt. And you can think it's a good thing or a bad thing, but the fact is, it's important to remember there is a line and to wrestle with that question, which we did all the time. I was impatient during my time at ABC News with people who said it all had to be one way or all the other, that we just did the really important news without regard to whether anybody was watching. I had a major anchor, not Peter, in front of a group early on in my tenure say that he didn't care about ratings at all and I shouldn't either. And I said to him, I won't use the name, I said to him, blank, I don't believe that and I don't think you do either. Because if you're really a journalist, you care about whether people are paying attention to what you're saying. If you don't care whether anybody's paying attention to you, then you're not a journalist, you're taking a diary. And that's fine to keep a diary, no problem with that. But by definition, if you really believe in what you're saying and it's important, you have to figure out ways to get a lot of people to watch it. On the other hand, I was equally impatient with people who said, just go for the ratings no matter what, because there were any number of times when we had an obligation to cover a story well past the point that people were really interested in it, well past the point where ratings would come in, and try to figure out how to cover it in a way to get people to watch. I mean, Iraq is a good example. The first 2 or 3 months in Iraq, in the war in Iraq, everybody wanted to follow it. By the time we got 5 months in, 6 months in, you could just see people running away from their television sets. Because it was, they'd heard the story already, it was not going well, they didn't like the way it was going, and yet we had an obligation that we took very seriously. As long as we were there, we, the United States, and its troops were there, we had to cover it. So Peter was raising right at the very outset something that was a very important issue that I wrestled with the whole time, and that it's important for all of us to think about as well, how we draw that line between news and entertainment. The most important story, I mean, it's hard to rank these things, maybe it's foolish, but the most important story that we covered during my time had to be 9/11. Certainly it's the one that had the most impact on me. It was, I mean, we all have this experience in our own way. It was a wrenching, difficult, tragic, unsettling, disturbing time for all of us. When you're in a news organization, it has certain different aspects to it. Because on the one hand, you're following it very closely, and so if anything, you know more about it than some people in the audience might know. You have to be covering it nonstop and giving it your full attention, pretty much 24 hours. And we were on the air from from 8:47 that morning, that Tuesday morning, straight through until Saturday morning without an interruption. We were on straight through, no commercials, no breaks, no nothing. We were just on straight through. And it's a time when all of us, I think, wanted to reach out to our loved ones and our families and things like that, and it's the last thing you could do in the news organization. You had to be paying attention to your job, you had to be at the job. We ask a lot of our news organizations at times like that. It also is incredibly chaotic. You don't know what the story is. By 10 o'clock that morning, we'd all seen things that were unimaginable. And so when other reports came in, as they did throughout that first day, second day, about possible things that happened, you couldn't rule any of them out. Any of them could be possible at that point, because we'd already seen things. When that first tower came down, Peter was on the air with John Miller beside him. We had a correspondent down at Ground Zero. And the correspondent said, well, the building has come down. And Peter said, no, you don't mean the building's come down. The building couldn't have come down, just a piece of the building's come down. And they said, no, the building's come down. It took 3 or 4 exchanges on the air for Peter to comprehend that the entire tower had come down. So there were all these things that were unimaginable, and yet you had all these other reports that turned out to be false, ultimately, that you didn't know and you couldn't particularly rule out. It's also chaotic in terms of just getting people to the scene, worrying about their safety. Are they safe going down and covering? At the same time, you have to get people to the scene. This is both Pentagon and down at Ground Zero in Manhattan. We had, within an hour and a half that morning, that Tuesday morning, our news desk started getting these emails in from some email address that nobody recognized. And it was something, this might not be exactly, but it was something like Hot Babe 27. And they kept emailing in, and they kept rejecting spam, spam, spam. And it took us 15 or 20 minutes to realize it was George Stephanopoulos. George had gotten on the subway and gotten down as close as he could, and then he'd walked down, and he talked his way into some young woman's apartment near Ground Zero. And he was on her email account, desperately trying to report what he was seeing and people he was talking to, and it took us 15 minutes to realize it was George Stephanopoulos, because we were just rejecting it all as it came by. So it was incredibly chaotic, very difficult. You also get to see the very best in people, as I think probably we all did in our own ways, but you see people's character very, very quickly, and who can step up and who did step up and did extraordinary work. At the same time, in the middle of all of that, there's a lot of controversy. We got into it on the first day with the White House, because if you recall, President Bush came out and spoke briefly to camera from Florida, where he was down in the elementary school, and then said, I'm getting on Air Force One, I'm going back to Washington. And that seemed plausible, it's fine. And then we didn't hear anything from him. And it became clear he was not coming back to Washington. At the same time, Vice President Cheney had gone to a secure location, and there was nobody in the federal government talking to us. We tried our best to get him, and it's understandable. A, they were concerned about the security of the president and the vice president and the leadership of the country, very understandable. B, they didn't know what was going on, and they didn't want to go out and start talking and not know what was going on. At the same time, from our point of view, we wanted somebody to be telling us what's happening. What do you know? What can you know? So we felt sort of alone out there, trying to report the facts and gather them together as best I could. And by the afternoon, Peter raised the question, where is the president? And he said repeatedly on the air, it's understandable that a security team wants him to be safe, and presumably that's why they're not bringing him back to Washington. At the same time, this is a time the country really wants to hear from him. Karl Rove went nuts. Went nuts. And as it got repieced, actually, because somebody by Thursday or so said, you need to call Karl Rove, because the White House is just furious with us. And you know, and you don't want the White House furious with you, because they can start withholding things from you. You know, they'll punish you. And this is true for any White House, by the way. They'll just say, okay, you don't get to interview, you know, the Secretary of Defense, or the Secretary of State, or the National Security Advisor, or whatever. We'll give it to other people, not to you. So I called him and I said, look at Karl, this is what Peter said. He said, no, Peter went on the air and called the president a coward. I said, never happened, Karl. And I ended up sending him the transcript. And he just sent me back a fax, which I still have, saying, I still think you're wrong. And it turns out, in fairness, this is how the media works, unfortunately. What had happened was Rush Limbaugh, on his radio program, had said, Peter Jennings went on the air today and called President Bush a coward. In fairness to Rush, a week later he apologized, because what had happened is somebody sent him an email telling him that. Now, I suppose it's obvious, Rush Limbaugh was not spending his time watching Peter Jennings that day. He didn't know. And he'd gotten this email and he repeated it on the air. And it was all a terrible mistake. But it was the beginning of a very intense period that went right on through certainly the beginning of the Iraq War, of the White House really pushing us hard on patriotism and what our patriotic responsibilities were. And more than once we heard from the White House, the rules are different now. We're under attack. And we want to work with the media. And it was a very difficult back and forth with the White House. I tried at various times, unsuccessfully every time, to say, you know what, I don't think it's doing anybody any favor. I don't think it's doing you, the White House, any favors if the American people think there's some secret deal being cooked up between the media and the government to withhold certain information from the people. Because then they're going to wonder, what else aren't you telling me? I think the best way to get people to feeling secure again is to feel they've got press who are really reporting out what they know. But the White House never bought that. Another controversial issue that came up that involved us specifically was the video of the towers coming down. Obviously it was terrible video. It got played, it got played, it got played again and again and again. And by the end of that week, some people, it was not ABC News, but some people were actually just putting it in what we call the bumpers, those little things that come at the top and come at the bottom, and putting it in promos, and it was all over the place. And after we'd been on the air for over 100 hours straight, we did a children's special in the morning on Saturday. Something that Peter Jennings was great at. He would do these specials for children about really difficult issues, where we'd bring a lot of children to the studio, and we'd bring some experts in, and we'd have them ask questions about, what do they know, what would they want to know, what questions they have about this. And in that, a man named Kyle Pruitt, who's a child development expert from Yale, made a very powerful point. He said, you have to understand, children process this differently. They think every time they see that video, it's a new building coming down. They have no idea that, in fact, it's the same thing happening again and again. And I called up on the way home from that, on the West Side Highway, I remember, I called up our head of standards, basically, our editorial quality person. I said, Carrie, we got this problem, and I want to impose a rule right now. We never show that moving video again, ever. And from that day on, ABC News never showed the moving video. On the anniversaries, we would show stills. We show still photos, but we would never show the moving video because we were potentially doing some harm to children. And I also, frankly, thought we were become so desensitized, it almost became like wallpaper, and these were people losing their lives that seemed like the wrong way to do it. Now, it wasn't all disaster or death. There was a lot of fun I had in my job. I got to go around the world and meet all sorts of interesting people, and you almost, this is not quite right, but you almost have access to anybody you want. I mean, I got, at one point, on the eve, actually, of the Iraq War, I got to go have dinner with Ariel Sharon in his residence, and the next day go over to Ramallah and visit with Yasser Arafat in his, remember that bombed-out headquarters that he had after the Israelis sort of holed him up there, which was a bizarre experience. And by the way, my impression of both men was exactly the opposite of what I thought it would be. I went in with some preconceptions, and I came out thinking very differently. I got to go have dinner with General Petraeus in the middle of the surge back in Iraq, which was fascinating to be there at that time. I got to go to North Korea, which was a bizarre experience, but it was worth doing to prepare for Diane Sawyer going over for a documentary and various work she did there. And I got to travel around Latin America, met with Hugo Chavez and some very interesting characters. So it was great. I got to go with Barbara Walters when she did her second Fidel Castro interview. And I flew down with her on the plane, and until you've seen Barbara Walters prepare for an interview, you have not seen work. Because she works and works and works. She starts weeks before an interview, if she has the time, and she asks for every question anybody could conceive of. She writes down all her questions. She ends up with hundreds of questions written out. And then she spends hour after hour paring these down and combining them and putting them in order. And we spent the whole plane flight down to Havana going over the questions again and again. So when she sits down and does the interview, it looks like she's just sort of coming up with these things. The fact is she's really thought it through carefully. That's why she's a really great interviewer for that reason. You almost have to see that process to realize how much work goes into a truly skillful interview. Then we got down there, and the way it works with Fidel Castro, I'm told, and this was my only experience, is he doesn't set a schedule and a time when you're going to meet with him. They just say, well, he'll let you know, he'll let you know. So we sat around for 3 or 4 days waiting to hear from El Jefe. And finally some senior officials came over to the hotel to have a drink with us. And we're standing around with Barbara, and the senior most official says, well, okay, now we're ready to see your questions. And Barbara and I sort of look at each other, and my heart sinks. I think, well, this is going to be the interview. Because I said, I'm sorry, we don't show people our questions in advance. And fortunately, the interview went ahead, and it was a fascinating experience. Being around Castro was very interesting, even at that stage in his life. I mean, he was a very charismatic, remarkable sort of man. And you have to bear in mind, I mean, this man's dealt with Khrushchev. This guy's dealt with JFK. He's been around through such historic events and has been such a player on the world stage. Sometimes the most important stories are actually not the most obvious stories, and I put Diane's story at the top of the list of the people who deals with these sorts of things, because she has an ability, but more than an ability, she has a courage that she can take a story that you might think you're not interested in and really make it interesting and compelling to you. I mean, she has done extraordinary work with women in prisons and with prostitution in this country. And particularly in poverty. She's done a series of reports now on poverty. She went to Camden, New Jersey, and slept in some very poor houses and covered the stories, particularly the children in Camden. We spent more than a year working on Appalachia in the United States and some of the extreme poverty in Appalachia, and she's gone into the Indian reservations. I remember when we did the Appalachia thing, I sat down on the floor of her office. She has these screenings where she has all sorts of people in, and I sat down on the floor to watch the screening. It's beautifully done. She does gorgeous work, and it was really compelling. But one of my notes was, what's a holler? Because she kept talking about going up the holler. And she's from Kentucky, as you may or may not know. So this is the next thing. I said, I'm sorry, I'm from Michigan. We didn't have hollers. I mean, holler means to yell. I mean, what are you talking about? And she said, oh, no, it's this valley that goes up where the stream is. I said, well, I think you're going to have to explain to some people what that is, because I'm not sure everybody's going to understand it. So that was my contribution to Diane Sawyer's documentary work. One of the biggest issues that I dealt with during my time at ABC News was not so much a news story, although it was covered in the news, as it was about the news industry itself. Because the news industry went through a remarkable transformation during the time I was there. To think back, I went to ABC News in the beginning of March of 1997. In the beginning of March of 1997, Fox News and MSNBC were only a few months old, and they were not registering. I mean, nobody was watching them. They were hardly even on cable systems. The internet was in its infancy. ABCnews.com didn't exist until we created it the first year I was there. So we didn't even have a website. Much less, social media and Facebook and Twitter and even search with Google. These things were all things yet to come. And now, of course, streaming video and blogs and all those things. So it was a very different world at that point that, we had some inkling of, I think we had no sense at the time of how profound the transformation would be. So that now there's an almost unlimited number of ways that all of us can get our news and information. Anytime, day or night, any device that you can conceivably want for. There's a huge tent now. And that tent incorporates an awful lot of things. It has everything from more traditional news being done by journalists following those time-honored principles, all the way through news interlaced with extreme opinion, to gossip and salacious content and just pure speculation, and it all comes under a very big tent. I think that choice is a good thing for us overall. I think in general, choice is a good thing. But one of the consequences of having that range of choice is it puts a lot more pressure on all of us as consumers of news than we've ever felt before. To a very large degree now, we all have to be our own editors. We have to judge what's believable, what's not believable, what's credible, what's not credible, or what sources are credible and what sources aren't credible. There is some great work being done on the internet and mobile today. Some wonderful work being done. And we shouldn't overlook that. It's funny, Peter Jennings was in some ways an early adopter of these things. In 2004 again, he came to me and said, David, I really want to go back to the days when we cover conventions gavel to gavel. And I know that the network is never going to let us have that kind of time. It just financially would be ruinous to just cover gavel to gavel. He said, but I wonder if there's something with this streaming video. this is sort of early days. We had experimented some with stream video, but early days. And if we could do something with stream video, Peter Jennings, will anchor on the webcast, the entire thing gavel to gavel. And so we put together in 2 or 3 months something that's now called ABC News Now. It was the first, I believe it was the first 24-hour streaming video news channel that we did at Peter's instance for the convention, and then we kept it up after that. So Peter saw this as an opportunity to do some of the more old-fashioned work, actually, that used to be done on the broadcast networks that now could be done on the internet. George Stephanopoulos, in the category of just great work being done, George Stephanopoulos is a terrific political reporter, and I follow him on Twitter all the time. And Jake Tapper is somebody we hired as the White House correspondent for ABC News, wonderful political reporter. I learn things all the time, and there are people from other networks too. I don't mean to just talk about ABC News, but I know that best. But there's great work being done on the internet. There's also some work that'll just make you cringe. As I say, it's a very big tent, and there's a lot under that tent. And the fact is, not all of the companies who have gone into this space, or even the people who have gone into space, are interested. There you go. I think it's the cheerleading squad. Not everybody who's gone into this space wants to make the financial investment that's required to actually do serious, good reporting. Because a very important thing to understand, something I certainly embraced, is you cannot do really good journalism without spending money. You have to figure out the business plan. And there are some people who are willing to spend that kind of money and invest it in the internet and mobile. There are a lot of people who are not. That's part of the reason. For the last year or so, I've been working with a company we named NewsRight, which is owned by 29 newspaper companies, to try to figure out a way that the newspaper companies can benefit financially from some of the reporting, their reporting that's being used on the web. It's funny, people talk about the demise of newspapers, and as we all know, it's really tough out there for newspapers. And it's getting tougher. There was a big bankruptcy announced just yesterday, actually, a Journal Register company. But with all the talk about the demise of newspapers, if you go on the internet today, an awful lot of the news and information you get ultimately is sourced to newspapers. Now, it may not be on the newspaper website you're seeing it, because what happens is the newspaper website posts the story, and then other people automatically, often with bots, they're called, short I think for robots, but bots, come across automatically and scrape stories and then put it on another website where they can get money for it. And so what NewsRight is trying to do is come up with a reasonable licensing way of having some money come back to the newspaper companies for a simple reason. If the newspaper companies are the ones investing in the reporting, and most and increasingly larger portions of the revenue are going to the people not paying for the reporters, sooner or later you won't pay for reporters anymore. We just won't have reporters. And it's part of, not the only, but part of the reason that we've seen all those cuts in newsrooms in newspapers around the world. So that's part of the reason I've been working on that to try to help them. It is very hard to do, to change expectations. Please understand, this is not a way of getting you to pay for it when you get the news, but other people are already getting money off of advertising and subscription dollars from third parties for work being done by the newspapers that has to get remedied. So the big question for me, the big question that I took away from my time, that I'm still thinking about and wrestling with, but it's a question that all of us, I think, should think about, is to what degree do the fundamental changes in the very nature of the news media in this country, to what degree do they affect some of the fundamental underlying principles that lie behind the journalism? Things like, as I said, do we pursue stories because they're important, or do we pursue them because they're popular? And that issue is much more in the forefront when you get to an internet or a mobile approach where you can track by the moment how many hits you're getting and how many people you're having coming. We're not talking about overnight ratings anymore. You can see it moment to moment, which stories are climbing with more and more traction and which ones are declining. Other issues such as checking and rechecking sources and making sure you get it right. Taking on stories that are maybe unpopular and may have adverse consequences for you. Those sort of time-honored principles. The question is, to what extent can we preserve those principles even as the very fundamental nature of the news media has shifted around us? Given all that's happened, the biggest surprise for me over my time, I've been watching it now for 15 years, is not that there isn't more great work, great reporting being done on the internet. The big surprise to me is that there is as much as there is. There actually is a very great amount being done out there. If you go and you find it. In the early days of abcnews.com, Charlie Gibson used to look at these daily reports we have. This is very antiquated now, but in the early days, you'd have the top 10 stories every day on the website. And Charlie used to just complain bitterly that if you looked at those top 10 stories, there were only 4 of the top 10 that were really what we would think of as substantive, important, weighty stories. There were 6 of them that were, the walking fish, sort of thing. And I used to always say to Charlie, I think you should look at it exactly the opposite way around. Given the fact that they can go to anything they want, and they can watch and read anything they want, it's encouraging that 4 of them are really important stories. So that people are seeking those out and pursuing them. So I thought the glass was at least half full. Now, this is the thought that I really want to leave you with tonight, and then I'd love to take whatever questions you have. The real issue is what we're going to have as a nation for our news media going forward. In the end, it's up to all of us to decide whether all these developments, this explosion of news sources, are going to make us a more informed populace, a more informed electorate, or it's going to really degrade the quality of the journalism and take it down to the lowest common denominator. And those are the 2 options. And it's up to us to decide that. People will get the quality of the news that they want and they demand. And therefore, to some extent, that they deserve. One of the things I learned at ABC News was even the very best journalists and even the very best news organizations pay attention to the audience. And over time, if the audience is coming and spending their time and attention with what they're doing, they will do more of it. They do respond. It is a 2-place function. It's not just one person speaking. It's not just the journalists. And so if everyone rushes to the latest salacious rumor about a celebrity, then you know what? You're going to get more reporting on salacious rumors about celebrities. One of the things that I find humorous but annoying sometimes are people who come up and will give me chapter and verse about some outrageous story that shouldn't be covered that much. But the fact that they can give me such detail shows me they've spent a fair amount of time. Listen to this, and I want to say, well, just turn it off. Or go somewhere else. You're encouraging them. With your behavior, you're encouraging them to do this because you get to vote. You get a vote in all of this. Now, what this means, and this is really my closing, what this means is that if people seek out some of the great, truly great reporting that's being done, and that's on television, it's in newspapers, it's on the internet, it's on mobile, if they seek out that great reporting, then we will get more of it. And that, in the end, for me, and I think for most of us, is the goal that we really want to achieve. And with that, thank you very much, and I'd love your questions.
Thank you for a very well delivered talk. One thing that recently came out, credibility is a factor, was on reporting of the Democratic convention still going on, and they had the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts talking about what Romney did. It was like an opposite of everything he claimed. Was that a political witch hunt, or was it accurate, or what?
Now, let me understand the question. I remember the lieutenant governor, what's her name? I've forgotten her name.
My name is Alvin.
Oh, no, but the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts.
Oh, it was a woman.
It was the woman who served with Romney,
I think so.
Not the current lieutenant governor, right? And I know she gave remarks, and pardon me?
Isn't she running for office?
Could be for another office.
Yeah. But your question is, she was inaccurate about...
She claimed he didn't do anything right. I mean, he didn't have, the state went downhill in credit rating.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
It was during the convention.
The Democratic convention?
Yes.
Attacking Romney.
I mean, there was some one thing that he's claiming that she said that's
Well,
accurate.
I think this goes back to what I started with, I think that you have to expect the two sides to disagree, right? And sometimes they even disagree over the facts. And that's the job of the journalists, to try to come down and say, okay, what's true here and what's not true? He's right, she's wrong, whatever it is. That is the job of the journalist. And that's what I was saying at the beginning. I think one of the biggest problems with the news media in recent years, at least, has been buying into this fair and balanced theme. There are some stories that should be fair and balanced. There's some that there's a right or wrong, and it's our obligation to try to tell you as best we can. We've looked into it, and this is what's true and it's not true. By the way, it's not just in politics. I think this is true in, I'll be controversial, global warming, that I spent some time and effort on. If you really look at the experts' opinions, it's not a close call about the two.
Could you respond to the statement that the media is liberal and favors liberal causes?
Yeah, it's one of the things I heard most often, still here to this day, and I found it the hardest thing to address. And I'll tell you exactly what I think about it, and I go into this a fair amount in the book because I think it's a really important issue. I used to say, maybe this is a little flip or cynical, I used to say at ABC News about the people who worked at ABC News, my job was not to change your heart, my job was to change your behavior. Ministers are in their job to change your heart, but what I could manage was behavior. And so I never tried to figure out what people's political preferences are. If you asked me, I would tell you my guess would be the majority of people at ABC News typically voted Democratic. That would be my guess. I don't know that. Nobody told me that. By the way, we have rules at ABC News that prevent you from telling me that. You know, we don't want to know. And you're not supposed to belong to parties. You're supposed to be independent. You're not supposed to register for a party. You can't work, can't vote, anything. But if you were going to ask me, I would guess that that's right, just given the nature of the people there. Not exclusively, but predominantly. But my point always was, we all have a bias about this, that, or the other thing. I mean, I come from Michigan. I went to the University of Michigan for 7 years when Bo Schembechler was there. I am not neutral about Woody Hayes or Ohio State. You know, you can't ask me to be that. I'm not going to be. And if I were covering an Ohio State-Michigan game, I would have a tough time. You know, I would try. But the two things you can do to address that, and this is what we did try to do, is number one, try to identify our biases and try to compensate for them, try to minimize them, and not allow people to say things in the newsroom that were clearly of a biased nature. But the second thing, and this is why diversity in newsrooms is so terribly important, because I think the best antidote to bias is to have somebody from a different point of view there. Because frankly, number one, it changes what you say and how you say it. And secondly, it's very helpful, and this happened repeatedly when I was at ABC News, have somebody say, wait a second, there's part of the country that doesn't look at it that way. And I'm not just talking about Republican, Democrat, you know, liberal, conservative. I'm talking about religious diversity and socioeconomic diversity and even geographic diversity. I always felt like I was in a minority because I was from the Midwest. You know, and the Midwest was not particularly favored on the East Coast in my experience. People think we're sort of are hayseeds, you know, sort of primitive people. The most important thing, and this is why I thought diversity was so terribly important in a newsroom. It's the only way you can possibly try to overcome it. And then just to really preach for getting it right rather than letting our bias creep in. But to deny that we're biased is just foolish. We're all biased in ways that we recognize, in some ways we probably don't recognize.
What kind of support do the newspapers of the European Union countries enjoy from their citizens? Do they have the same problem we have, or is there more support there?
Well, they have problems, but not as bad. Now, first of all, I'm not an expert on this, so I don't want to hold myself as an expert. But I know some about the UK and some about Germany in particular. And my strong sense is that there is still a great deal more loyalty and support for newspapers and more traditional news there than there is here. Now they are going through difficult times, and the internet is part of the cause for that, because one of the investors in Newsright is a German newspaper company, and so I've talked with them about that. So they're not immune from this, but it's not nearly what it is in this country. They're in much better shape. It's a different, I think it's a different tradition, a different culture, a different history. It's just very different. But also, as you know, you don't have the local monopolies typically in Europe that you do here. I mean, a lot of your English newspapers are national newspapers. A lot of your German newspapers are national newspapers, and in France as well. So it's a very different sort of system. Here you have local monopolies that have really just seen, particularly in the larger and the mid-range, seen erosion. Ironically, a lot of the smaller, really small community newspapers have done better here in general.
We continually hear that younger people are not reading newspapers and magazines. They are getting all of their information, all of their news from the internet. Are they really getting the news, and will that likely continue, and is it effective?
Yeah. The source, I mean, the mechanism by which, that's absolutely true. Increasingly younger people get their news is the internet and mobile, that's right. The ultimate source of that often is actually the newspapers. There was a study done by Pew, I think it was, about 2 years ago in Baltimore, where they took over a given, I think it was a 1 week period of time, for just local Baltimore news outlets. And there were something like, 35 or so. There was one newspaper. Actually, there was a second, which was a financial specialty newspaper, and then 3 television stations and some radio stations, and then a slew of internet news providers. And they took the top 5 or 6 stories from that week, and on each one of them took all the reports on all those outlets and traced it back to where it came from. And it turns out something like 50% of all the reporting on those came from the Baltimore newspaper. It wasn't always attributed that way, but that's where the reporting came from. And if you added in the television stations and the radio, you got up to over 95% of all the content being delivered by the internet and mobile was actually coming from the more traditional outlets. So they are getting information that way. So I see that, frankly, as much a business model problem as anything else. Because if that continues, then the traditional outlets can't afford to do the work to get the reporting done. Because we have a lot of other people who are sort of getting a free ride. And I think that's the biggest problem.
How will young people feel going into journalism if it's very hard to make a living as a journalist?
It's interesting to me. Did everybody hear the question? How do young people feel about going to journalism when it's so hard to make a living? Which is absolutely right, by the way. It's crazy. I mean, Columbia Journalism School, I think, costs $40,000, $50,000 to go to Columbia Journalism School. They're going to come out and get a job that in the first year literally pays $25,000. I mean, it's really hard to justify. I have 2 thoughts about that. Number one, it's remarkable given that how many really great, talented young people are still coming to journalism because they just love it. They love the doing of it. They want to be journalists. So number one, that's right. Number two, I have both the disadvantage but also the advantage of having come to this mid-career and not having been a journalist from the outside. And I used to say this at ABC News repeatedly when I'd hear a lot of moaning about the way it used to be and how much better it was. I used to say, look, I've been blessed with a lot of great jobs. There is no job as great as this job, as going in and being a journalist at a big news organization. If you think about it, you get to come in every day, you work with really smart, really curious people. Your job is to find out things that nobody else knows, and then try to tell other people about it in a way that's compelling and understanding and things like that. And on a good day, and it's not every day, but on a good day, you have a fighting shot of making a difference, of actually improving the world a little bit. There are a lot of good jobs that don't have that combination of factors. So I actually think it's a wonderful thing to do. Having said that, it's hard to compete with ESPN. It's a pretty attractive alternative, which is, by the way, a great organization.
Hey, thanks for coming. So a while back, there was an article in the New York Times public editor, and he asked basically, should the Times be a truth vigilante?
Oh.
And one, I was wondering if you had thoughts on that, if you think TV news should be truth vigilantes. And I was also wondering if you could speak about the idea of separate fact-check segments versus integrating those fact-check segments in the main thrust of the news. and I'm kind of throwing a lot on your plate. I was wondering if you could define
I've got it so
for
far.
you, right?
Yeah.
For you, what exactly constitutes a lie, and when would it be appropriate to use that label?
Well, actually, these three questions were related are very hot right now. Particularly, I mean, if you go on the Pointer blog and things like that, there's a lot of talk about this right now. New Republic is writing a lot about it. Fallows is writing about it. This is right. What the journalists are all talking about right now are these issues. I know that public editor who just stepped down. He actually was an editor of a newspaper, Cap Cities, when I was general counsel. I wouldn't have used the term truth vigilante because I don't see how anyone could want to be a vigilante. It doesn't sound like a good thing to do. But I think his basic point was dead on. It was, we have an obligation, this is what I was saying at the beginning, we have an obligation to do more than just throw it up in the air and let you decide. There are some things that we have an obligation to say, yes, there are two sides, here are the two sides, we can't decide, we don't know. But where it's possible for us to advance and actually look into it on your behalf and say, we've looked into this and this is what we conclude, there's an overwhelming weight of the evidence, one or the other, I think there's an obligation to do that. The fact checking, frankly, I think the fact checking as a separate function is more a marketing issue than anything else. Every journalist should be a fact checker. I mean, that should be in the heart of all journalism that's done every single day. But you can put up segments on your evening newscast that say, you know, we're fact checking. You know, it's glitzy and it's great. But we should be doing that all the time. And the third question was, oh, well, you know, I don't know as a matter of journalism. I can tell you my personal reaction. I have a tough time really saying anyone's lying, because lying for me is, it's not only false, but you knew it to be false and you told it with the intention of misleading. Now, there are some cases where, obviously, I mean, I think it's fair to say that John Edwards, in his interview with Bob Woodward, when he said, absolutely not, it couldn't be my child, was lying, you know? So there are some extreme examples, but apart from that, you know, actually, I go back to law for a second. I've been thinking about this recently. At least back when I was practicing law and I was a lawyer, there was something called sharp practice. When you go into the court, and it's not so much you'd out and out lie to the court, but you'd sure tell them part of the story and not the whole story and not lay it all out there. And sharp practice was not a good thing to do. And I think there's a lot of sharp practice being done right now. And that's frankly what I was talking about before. I think if you look back, and this is not meant to be a biased political statement, but a recent example is Representative Ryan and his remarks to the Republican convention. When you go back, you know, and he has at President Obama hard on Bowles-Simpson and not sufficiently backing Bowles-Simpson. Perfectly fair, personally, just speaking personally, I think Bowles-Simpson has a lot to be said for it, and we should be taking a hard look at it. But he omits the fact he was on the commission and voted against it, and he was an important part of the reason why it didn't get bipartisan. That's kind of sharp practice. You should sort of do it. The most important thing about that for me is, not so much that it's done, is I think you lose credibility with your audience over time if you do that. Because once you hear that and you know somebody's done it, the next time they say something, you say, well, wait a second, I'm not sure about that. What else isn't he telling me? And that's the real damage in that. But I think it's an important function for the journalist to be pointing that out. So you can decide what you think.
David, this is not meant to be a partisan question. President Obama has used every form and every channel of communication more to a greater extent than any other president. He's on the talk shows, he's on Letterman, he's on The View, he's on Ellen, he's on everything. And yet, and he's on, and then interviewed by mainstream media. Yeah. And yet he's viewed as a bad communicator. Almost universally. He hasn't done a good job communicating what it is he thinks he's done. What can you say about his communication strategy? Has he been overexposed? What's wrong with his communication strategy? That's my question.
Well, he hasn't asked me for advice, and I guess, and I haven't thought that much about it. And this is just really speculation, which journalists shouldn't be doing. But you know, we're among friends. Let me speculate. First of all, I think he is very smart, and very eloquent, and he can express himself very clearly. I think that if I were going to guess, and this is really just speculative, but looking at the way they did it, I think in the early days, the people immediately around him had such belief in his communication skills. They believed he could pull out anything. And it's understandable why they did it. Some of the speeches he gave, I mean, were just extraordinary. I mean, that red blue speech back in 2004, and then the one on race that he gave, and it's just extraordinary. But as a result, if you look at the way he staffed himself, he didn't have really anybody else to put out there to deal with it. And so in the early days, I mean, it was like a running joke with the network. Wow, how many primetime press conferences we're going to have? We were having like one a month. And I do think at some point you can over-communicate. The other thing is, to some extent, it's not just communication, it's what you have to communicate. I mean, there have not been a lot of great fun things to communicate. And he's had difficulty with it. And part of it, I'm sure, is temperament. I mean, for any of you, and this is not meant to be a political statement at all or a biased statement, but when you saw President Clinton last night, you were reminded, boy, this guy is amazing. Whether you like what he's saying or don't like what he's saying, he is amazing. In fact, you know, my wife Sherry worked for Reagan and then was in the Bush 41 White House. And she said at one point, she said, when did this switch? Because if you remember back to the Reagan days with Mike Deaver and things like that, they were masters at communication and stagecraft and things like that. They were just the best. And boy, when you watch some of that convention over the last couple of days, whatever you think about the substance, it's just beautifully done as a technical matter. So some of it is temperament, and I think, you know, all the things that have been reported, I think they're in the Woodward book, right, that is being leaked right now, that he has a reputation of President Obama being somewhat aloof, and that's maybe who he is, and he's different from Bill Clinton, who's all over you. You know, again, whether you like it or not, he's all over you. Who next? Ellen, you're in charge. Go ahead.
You can just repeat it if I don't get to you fast.
Okay, that's all right. Go ahead. Ellen, don't or you're going to hurt yourself.
How much pressure do you and people like you feel from above, from corporate superstructures, to influence the news?
Yeah, this is I'm glad you asked that question because it's often, I think, in my experience at least, misperceived. There were times, now, when I was at ABC News, there were basically two different people, different times, who ran the company. One was Michael Eisner and one was Bob Iger. And they were very different. But there were clearly times when there was no doubt in my mind that the head of the company was not pleased with what we were reporting. But nobody ever asked me to change it. Nobody ever, you know, said there were going to be consequences. But it was clear they had a point of view and they didn't like it. The issue, I think, is not so much that. And people tend to think that, you know, they just call you up and say, change this or change that or do this. I mean, I don't know if anybody, is anybody watching Newsroom, that HBO show? And, you know, Jane Fonda is saying, we're going to fire him and all that stuff. That's not my experience. That's great drama. That's not the way it works. No, the pressure is a different kind of pressure. The pressure in this day and age is to run a business that is responsible, that's earning a reasonable operating income. And that pressure is really great, particularly when essentially it's a declining business. The broadcast news business is in decline. Broadcasting overall is in decline. Now there's digital that's coming up, but it's not replacing the revenue. This is what you're seeing in the newspapers. It's a lot of part of the newspapers. It's true in television as well. Television is just a few steps behind print. And that is the much greater pressure about how you can continue to serve the public and do the things you think really ought to be done and need to be done, and still make sure that you're not going into the red, because it's awful easy to go to the red. You'll never make as much money as the entertainment side. You know, you won't make as much money as the theme parks. Never going to happen. But it's not an eleemosynary institution. It's a publicly traded company. You have a responsibility to the shareholders ultimately to have some operating income.
Can they exercise influence in their selection of people like you?
Oh, sure, of course, they can. I mean, and who they select indicates what they want out of people. At the same time, given the way it has worked, at least up to this point, there's some protection, because if it got out, you know, if the New York Times got a hold of the fact that the corporation, one of the corporations were putting pressure on their broadcast news division to report the news a certain way, it would be really ugly. And there have been some rumors about that. If you remember when Jack Welch was running GE, there were rumors about his being around on election night and really being unhappy because the Democrats were doing well or something. I have no idea if that's true, but it got reported at the time. And so there's some inherent protection. One more.
Pick.
No, you don't have to pick.
I'm going to go right over here to this woman, and I apologize, but we're running out of time.
You just mentioned responsibility of the channels to the people. In the last few years, in order to get more news from Europe and from Asia, I watch BBC News. I think American television channels and stations and newsrooms have been very irresponsible in not showing enough news from other parts of the world. We're in the global economy in every which way. And the news that we get is about, well, it's not enough about the rest of the world.
Well, I think my response is good for you. I know you're doing exactly what you should do. By the way, it's more on radio actually than TV, but I go to the BBC. I go to the BBC website regularly for that. So I think that's part of my point is if enough people do that, then it will change what the broadcast networks do as well. They're responding to people. I also think, in fairness, two things, and this will sound defensive, probably is, frankly, but two things. One is these things come and go. It depends on what the news is. Abe Rosenthal actually did a study at one point where he said actually there was an unusual amount of international coverage in the 60s and 70s because of the Vietnam War. And he went back to the New York Times front pages in the 20s, and there was one front page he had where I think 5 of the stories on the front page were about boxing matches. So he said this thing come and go. So some of it's secular. So if you would ask me 20 years ago, would Americans know the difference between Shias and Sunnis? I would have said there's no chance. And yet, throughout the Iraq situation, there was a lot of coverage about it, which there should be. Having said that, my personal bias is exactly your personal bias, which I think that there should be more international coverage. I think that's right. Maybe you're right also in your question, in what you imply, that as we become more and more interdependent economically, our jobs are going, we'll learn to follow that. I mean, if you think back through history, England is much more international, but because they've always been a trading nation, that's been the basis of their economy. The United States for many, many years was fairly insular because we had a lot of natural resources, a large population, we had oceans on both sides. And as we become more and more interdependent with China, with India, with Brazil, I mean, it goes on and on, maybe that will correct itself. But I basically agree with you. Great, thank you all very much. Thank you for all the questions.